It was near dusk when the wind shifted over the plains and brought with it the thundering sound of hooves, fast, wild, and riderless. Annabelle Montgomery looked up from the fence she was mending, squinting toward the horizon as a blur of muscle and panic stormed past the edge of her fields. The horse, a large bay stallion with broken reins, vanished down the trail in a cloud of dust. Her heart jolted. Something was wrong. Without hesitation, she dropped her tools and ran. Her boots pounded the dry earth as she cut through the orchard, past the brittle rows of failed crops and the hollow shell of the old barn. Down by the creek bed she found him, crumpled in a patch of tall grass, half covered by wind-blown leaves. A man. Blood had matted his dark hair. His shirt was torn across the shoulder. One boot was missing. He groaned as she knelt beside him, his hand twitching in the dirt. "Sir?" she called, gently turning his face. "Can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered. Where am I?" "You're safe now," she whispered, though she wasn't sure it was true. He blinked slowly, pupils unfocused. "I don't know who I am." She stared at him for a long moment, then lifted him carefully, half carrying, half dragging his limp frame to the cart parked near the orchard gate. He was heavy with muscle, dressed finer than any man she'd seen in months. A wool vest under the dust, calloused hands, but not from farming. Whoever he was, he hadn't come from anywhere nearby. She brought him to her cabin and laid him on the cot near the fire. Cole, her loyal black dog, sniffed the man and gave a low grunt of approval before curling up beside him. That was enough for now. By morning, he was conscious but disoriented. When asked again, he simply shook his head. "I remember nothing," he said quietly, "not even my name." "Then you'll need a new one," she replied, folding her arms. "Let's start with Jack." He accepted it with a tired nod. Long before the stranger rode into her world, or rather fell into it, Annabelle Montgomery had lived a life shaped by silence, survival, and sunburnt resilience. Her family's farm, once the pride of New Crestwood, stretched across a patch of high country where the grass once grew thick and golden, and orchard blossoms painted the wind with sweet perfume. The Ridgeway land was a place of laughter, of church picnics, of harvest dances and barn weddings. But that was years ago, a different life, a different girl. The collapse came slowly, like the ground softening before a sinkhole. First, a sudden blight wiped out their apricot trees. Then, a year of drought. Then floods that drowned the winter wheat. When the barn caught fire during a lightning storm and their last breeding stallion was lost, her father stopped singing. Not long after, he collapsed in the fields. Heart attack, the doctor said, though Annabelle always believed it was something sadder, the breaking of a man who'd held too much for too long. Her mother wasted away by the fireplace. Her brother left for Chicago with nothing but a suitcase and a letter she never opened. And just like that, the world quieted. Annabelle stayed. She was 19 when she inherited the land, and 30 when she found the stranger. In the years between, she learned to shoe horses, repair fences, butcher chickens, and negotiate prices with men twice her age. Her hands were strong. Her eyes sharper than any rifle she owned. She wasn't poor, not yet, but the line was thin. Sometimes she couldn't afford salt and sugar. Her boots had been resold twice. The property tax letters came in red envelopes. She burned them in the stove one by one. Neighbors offered to buy her out, always politely. "Sell it, Annabelle," they'd say. "You're too young to grow old out here." But they didn't understand. This wasn't just dirt, it was her mother's lullabies echoing in the hallway. Her father's initials carved into the barn door. The graves behind the chapel. Her past lived in the soil. To sell it would be to betray everything she'd fought to keep alive. And so, she stayed. When she wasn't tending the land, she read old poetry, local newspapers, worn-out almanacs. She knew the weather patterns better than most ranchers. She could tell the time by the way the light hit the orchard walls. She could spot a coyote from half a mile off and scare it with a single shot. But none of that prepared her for Jack. Not his silence. Not his haunted eyes. Not the ache in her chest when he said he didn't remember who he was, as if forgetting was a mercy she'd never been granted. She told herself she was only helping him because it was the right thing to do. But deep down in the part of her heart she rarely listened to anymore, she feared what it meant that she liked having him there. She feared how easily he felt like something she'd been missing. In the weeks that followed, the man who called himself Jack became part of the rhythm of Annabelle's days, as if he had always been there, just waiting for the right chapter to arrive. He rose early, even before the rooster, and stood barefoot on the porch watching the morning mist roll across the pasture. He chopped wood without being asked, repaired the fence without complaint, and fixed the leaky roof above the chicken coop as though it were instinct. Though his mind was a blank canvas, his hands remembered the world, how to use a hammer, saddle a horse, balance an account book, even quote passages from long-forgotten books. Annabelle noticed these things, quietly. She noticed how he hesitated when he held a silver spoon, how his posture stiffened when someone mentioned the town of Laramie, how his eyes flicked toward the hills every time a train whistle echoed in the distance. There were clues, but no answers. He didn't pry into her life, and she didn't pry into his. Not yet, but over time, questions settled between them like dust on a windowsill. At night they played cards by oil lamp. He was terrible at bluffing, but she let him win just enough to keep him trying. He would read aloud from a book of cowboy tales with a strangely crisp accent, then sit in silence afterward, staring into the fire like a man trying to remember something important and failing. One afternoon, while they were mending the irrigation trough, she asked, "What do you think you did before all this?" He paused, wiped sweat from his brow, and said, "I must have had money. My hands aren't built for plows." "You're doing just fine," she replied, but her chest tightened. Another time, she found him in the barn brushing down her old mule. He was humming, a melody she recognized from a piano sonata her mother used to play. But when she asked where he'd learned it, he blinked in confusion, like the song had come from a dream, Palahis. Annabelle kept her distance, but it was harder with each passing day. She began to anticipate the way he stirred his coffee, the way he frowned when something didn't line up, the way he spoke gently to the animals, and most dangerous of all, the way he looked at her like she wasn't broken, like she was enough. Then, one evening after a long day of hauling hay, he handed her a carved wooden figurine, a horse, shaped smooth, its features fine and precise. "For you," he said simply. "I thought the porch needed a sentinel." She took it, feeling the weight of the wood in her hand. "You didn't remember how to whittle," she said quietly. "No," he said. "But my hands did." It was a traveling merchant who delivered the news. Along with bolts of cloth and sacks of flour, he handed Annabelle a stack of old newspapers from the city, mostly outdated gossip and political squabbles. But one headline caught her eye: "Ashton Rutherford missing for 6 months. Railroad tycoon's heir vanishes." She stared at the photograph beneath the bold letters. It was Jack, or rather, Ashton. The merchant kept talking, oblivious, something about the price of salt. But Annabelle couldn't hear him. Her ears rang. Her fingers trembled around the crinkled paper. That night, she placed the article in Jack's hands. He went pale as he read it. The silence between them stretched. Then, like floodgates cracking open, memories began to trickle through. Flashbacks. Arguments. A storm. A horse. A fall. He remembered a mansion with marble staircases, a father with a cold voice, and an uncle who whispered of land deals and profit margins. "I was running," he said at last. "From them. From myself." She said nothing, only watched him. "I didn't fake the amnesia," he added. "I didn't know who I was, but I know who I want to be now." "And who is that?" she asked, quiet, but steady. He looked at her, eyes clearer than they'd ever been. "Not Ashton Rutherford. Not some tycoon's heir. Just a man who wants to fix a fence, build a life, and wake up beside you every morning." Her heart warred with itself, logic against longing. The man in her kitchen had once belonged to the world of power, railroads, and empires. But the man fixing her gate, whittling wood, and humming lullabies, he was hers. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that both could be true. It was a traveling merchant who delivered the news. Along with bolts of cloth and sacks of flour, he handed Annabelle a stack of old newspapers from the city, mostly outdated gossip and political squabbles. But one headline caught her eye: Ashton Rutherford missing for 6 months. Railroad tick, the peace didn't last. Just weeks after Ashton, no longer simply Jack, recovered his name, trouble came riding in on polished boots and false smiles. A man in a fine hat arrived at Annabelle's gate with papers in hand and a voice as smooth as oil. "Miss Montgomery," he said, tipping his hat, "representing Marrow Creek Holdings. We have documentation indicating your late father signed a contract transferring ownership of this property." She didn't even read it. "That's a lie." "Be that as it may," the man said with a smirk, "we'll be moving forward with acquisition. You'll want to vacate within 60 days. She slammed the door in his face. But that was only the beginning. Un's air vanishes. She stared at the photograph beneath the bold letters. It was Jack. Or, rather, Ashton. The merchant kept talking, oblivious. Something about the price of salt. But Annabelle couldn't hear him. Her ears rang. Her fingers trembled around the crinkled paper. That night, she placed the article in Jack's hands. Hall. He went pale as he read it. The silence between them stretched. Hall. Then, like floodgates cracking open, memories began to trickle through. Flashbacks, arguments, a storm, a horse, a fall. He remembered a mansion with marble staircases, a father with a cold voice, and an uncle who whispered of land deals and profit margins. "I was running," he said at last. "From them, from myself." She said nothing, only watched him. "I didn't fake the amnesia," he added. "I didn't know who I was, but I know who I want to be now." "And who is that?" she asked, quiet but steady. He looked at her, eyes clearer than they'd ever been. Not Ashton Rutherford, not some tycoon's heir. Just a man who wants to fix a fence, build a life, and wake up beside you every morning. Her heart warred with itself, logic against longing. The man in her kitchen had once belonged to the world of power, railroads, and empires. But the man fixing her gate, whittling wood, and humming lullabies, he was hers. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that both could be true. Overnight, the whispers began. A neighbor's well went dry. Another's barn mysteriously caught fire. Warning signs appeared, sometimes carved into doors, sometimes in the form of dead chickens hung from fences. Annabelle stood her ground, but Ashton recognized the playbook. It was the same strategy his uncle once used to strong-arm landowners across the frontier. Pressure, fear, ruin, and buyout. He knew because he had seen the contracts, heard the threats in back rooms. He'd once signed off on such deals himself. "They're not just coming for your land," Ashton said grimly. "They want everything. The valley, the water rights, the minerals beneath your feet. And they won't stop unless someone stops them first." He wanted to fight. Annabelle hesitated. Her strength was rooted in earth and sweat, not legal battles and shadow games. "They'll ruin you," she warned. "Then let them try," he replied. "I may have lost everything once, I won't lose you. Not again." So Ashton packed a bag and rode out before dawn, not as a forgotten man seeking peace, but as a son of an empire ready to burn the empire down. Ashton rode east into the city wearing a borrowed coat, a false name, and the weight of 2 lives on his shoulders. Gone was the farmhand with dusty boots and calloused hands. In his place stood a man who knew how to navigate marble halls and smoky boardrooms. A man who had once signed mergers with a pen worth more than most men's homes. A man who had grown up learning not how to love, but how to win. He knew exactly how Marrow Creek operated, because parts of its machinery had once belonged to his own family's empire. He had studied the contracts, sat in on the secret meetings. He knew how they buried clauses in ink and how they made people disappear. Not with violence, but with litigation, silence, and slow erosion. Under the name Clay Donovan, Ashton posed as a potential investor from Chicago. He infiltrated the Marrow Creek offices, dining with executives and shaking hands with men he once loathed. He smiled through it all, teeth clenched behind his charm. And quietly, he gathered evidence. Bakelets. Ethe ta. He bribed an assistant, photocopied documents, hid a wire inside a fountain pen. He collected proof of forged deeds, falsified environmental reports, secret payments to local officials. He found his uncle's signature, a damning relic of the past, on papers meant to displace dozens of families. It was dangerous work. Twice he was followed through alleyways. Once he caught someone rifling through his rented hotel room. But Ashton pressed on. He wasn't just fighting for Annabelle anymore. He was fighting for redemption. And when he finally boarded the train west, briefcase in hand and sun rising behind him, he wasn't the man who had fallen from a horse months ago. He was the man who would bring it all crashing down. The church bell rang out at noon, echoing through New Crestwood like a call to arms. Farmers arrived in wagons and on horseback. Shopkeepers locked up early. Children peeked through windows, sensing that something big was unfolding. The pews filled until there was no space left to sit, only standing room and held breath. Annabelle sat in the front row, hands clasped tightly in her lap. She hadn't seen Ashton since he'd left weeks ago. The silence had gnawed at her. She feared he'd vanished again, this time not because of memory loss, but by choice. Then the doors opened, and he walked in. He looked sharper than any of them remembered, in a clean coat, pressed shirt, and eyes that burned, not with fear, but fire. He carried a briefcase and a purpose. Sheriff Mallory stood beside the pulpit, arms crossed. "You better have something real, son." "I do," Ashton said. He took his place at the altar. Not as a preacher, not as a Rutherford heir, but as a man who had seen the machine from the inside and chose to tear it down. One by one, he laid out the documents. Forged signatures, hidden financial trails, memos revealing planned land seizures. He played a recording, a vice president of Marrow Creek, laughing about driving out that stubborn widow on Ridgeway land. Gasps filled the room, then murmurs, then outrage. "You mean to tell me this is all real?" someone shouted. "It's real," Ashton said, "and it's been happening for years. I helped build the machine once. But today, I'm here to destroy it." Someone began clapping, then another, and another. By the time the sheriff stepped forward, the room was electric. "We'll take it to the state," Sheriff Mallory said, lifting the folder. "This ain't over. But it's a damn good start." In the weeks that followed, state investigators arrived. The company was exposed. Arrests were made. Land deeds were returned. Merrill Creek Holdings collapsed. And through it all, Ashton stood beside Annabelle. Not as a savior, not as a hero, but as a man finally worthy of the life she'd built with her own two hands. Spring came early that year. The snow melted fast, revealing green shoots where the earth had once been gray. Wildflowers bloomed across the ridges, and the orchard trees, quiet and bare through winter, burst into blossoms so white they looked like falling snow when the wind stirred them. That's where Annabelle chose to marry him. Beneath the oldest cherry tree, the one her parents planted the year she was born, neighbors gathered in a circle of hay bales and folding chairs. There was no grand chapel, no choir, no gilded invitations. Just the scent of lilac, the laughter of children, and the steady hum of bees circling above. Annabelle wore her mother's lace dress, hand-mended and yellowed at the edges, but still beautiful. Her hair was tied back with ribbon, her boots scrubbed clean. She held a bouquet of wildflowers, gathered that morning from the same field where she'd once found Ashton half dead. Ashton wore a borrowed vest, sleeves rolled up, and a nervous smile. He fidgeted with the silver button on his cuff, but his eyes never left hers. The town's oldest pastor, a woman named Ruth, with a voice like gravel and honey, led the vows. "Do you promise," she said, "to stand together even when the land is dry, the harvest poor, and the roof leaks in more than one place?" "I do," they both said, grinning. The townsfolk cheered. Basa. They danced under lanterns strung between trees. Someone brought a fiddle. Someone else brought pie. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't rich, but it was honest. Basa. And when the stars came out, Ashton pulled her aside and whispered, This is the first time I've ever truly known who I am." Annabelle leaned her forehead against his. "And who is that?" "A man lucky enough to be yours." Marriage didn't turn the land softer or the sky kinder. The first summer after their wedding, a hailstorm tore through the western fields, flattening crops they had planted together by hand. That autumn, a coyote snatched half their hens, and when winter came early, they huddled by the fireplace, rationing firewood and watching their breath fog in the air. But they faced every hardship together. They argued about money, about repairs, about whether to buy a new plow or save for a wind pump. Sometimes Ashton still woke in the night from dreams of boardrooms and betrayal. Sometimes Annabelle pulled away, still afraid she might one day lose everything again. But they always found their way back to each other. Ashton turned the barn into a gathering place, building benches from old fence posts, hanging lanterns, and painting the walls with chalkboard lessons. He taught children arithmetic and grown men how to read their land contracts. Bullies. Annabelle started a seed library. She collected heirloom seeds from neighbors, cataloged them in glass jars, and offered them freely to anyone willing to plant. Her hands were never idle, and her joy grew as surely as her flowers did. The farm transformed, not into a profitable empire, but into a living thing, a community. People came for advice, for supper, for shelter. Lost boys, widows, travelers. No one left without a full belly and a place to rest. One spring, a young girl knocked on their door carrying nothing but a bundle of soaked cloth. Annabelle let her in without question. Ashton built her a bed. They never had children of their own, but the farm was full of life. And on the quietest nights, after the chores were done and the porch creaked under their weight, they sat side by side, hands clasped, watching the fireflies rise from the grass like stars too restless for the sky. It was during a late autumn storm that Ashton found himself alone in the study, staring at a blank sheet of parchment and an uncapped fountain pen. Annabelle was asleep, curled beneath a quilt stitched by her mother decades earlier. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. A branch scraped the roof like fingernails on wood. He hadn't thought about his uncle in years. The man who had once orchestrated land grabs whispered threats behind gold-rimmed glasses and tried to mold Ashton into something cold and useful. But tonight, memories clawed their way back. Fraki, so he wrote. He, not for vengeance, not for absolution, but for clarity. But for clarity. Sa, Uncle Hole, you taught me to calculate everything. The cost of land, the value of silence, the price of disobedience. But you never taught me how to build a home. Mon. I lost my memory and found my life. I fell from a horse and landed in grace. Bon, you built an empire. I built a kitchen table from reclaimed oak. Bon, you speak of legacy. I live it each morning in the way my wife sips her tea, in the seedling we planted last spring, in the laughter of a child who calls me Mr. Ash. I won't return. And I won't forget. May you one day understand the difference between wealth and worth. He folded the letter, sealed it with wax and placed it in a tin box. Sealy, he didn't mail it. Instead, the next morning he rode out to the old cherry tree, the one where he'd spoken his vows, where the blossoms had once rained down like snow, and buried it at the base. Not to hide it, but to let it rest. And when Annabelle asked what he'd done with his thoughts that day, he simply said, I gave them back to the ground. 25 years passed like the sweep of wind through wheat. The orchard had grown thick and full, branches heavy with fruit each summer. The barn Ashton had rebuilt was now weathered but strong, its walls filled with books, laughter, and generations of carved initials left behind by children who had come and gone like seasons. Annabelle's hair turned silver at the temples. Ashton's hands, once quick and steady, grew slower. But the land still knew them, and they still knew each other. On the eve of their 25th anniversary, their children, not by blood, but by bond, returned. Eliza, who had arrived on their porch as a scared 12-year-old, now served as the town's youngest mayor. Rowan, once a quiet orphan with a broken leg, had become a conservationist, traveling between towns teaching soil restoration and crop rotation. They organized a feast under the orchard trees. Tables were covered in gingham cloth and lit by strings of golden lanterns. Baskets overflowed with bread, corn, preserves, and cider pressed that morning. Fiddles played. Children danced barefoot in the grass. Ashton, leaning on his cane, watched the sky blush pink as the sun dipped low. He sat beside Annabelle, their fingers intertwined, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. People rose to give toasts. They spoke not of riches or success, but of warmth, of welcome, of safety. They spoke of Annabelle's strength and Ashton's quiet wisdom, of how this couple had not just held onto land, but nurtured it, and all who came with it. When Eliza raised her glass, her voice trembled. "You didn't just save us," she said. "You planted something lasting, and tonight it blooms." As the stars emerged, Ashton whispered, "This was worth every storm, every scar, every lost year." Annabelle smiled, eyes misty. "We built something no one can tear down." Above them, the cherry blossoms rustled in the night breeze, soft, ancient, and eternal. Ashton Rutherford died in his sleep on the first morning of spring. The sun had just begun to rise, casting soft gold across the curtains. The orchard was beginning to bud again, tiny green promises lining each branch. Annabelle found him in his chair beside the window, a book in his lap, his glasses slightly tilted, as if he'd simply drifted off mid-sentence, smiling faintly at something he'd read. He was 72. The town mourned as one. People came from miles around, farmers, school teachers, blacksmiths, the children he had taught and the grown men he'd once inspired. They walked behind his horse-drawn cart as it passed through New Crestwood, slow and silent. The flag on the schoolhouse flew at half-mast. The seed library closed for 3 days. Even the birds seemed quieter. Annabelle wore a simple black dress and walked alone behind the cart, holding a single sprig of wild cherry blossom. He was buried not in the town cemetery, but in the arroyo, the same dry riverbed where she had first found him all those years ago, crumpled in the dust, with no name and no past. She marked his grave with a smooth stone, uncarved, and planted a young oak tree beside it. "I don't need words for you," she whispered. "The land will remember." In the years that followed, the tree grew tall and strong, its roots gripping the earth where memory first bloomed. Annabelle continued to live in the farmhouse until her hands could no longer hold a hoe. When she passed, Rowan buried her beneath the cherry tree where she had married the man who once forgot who he was and found himself in her arms. Today, the farm still stands. Au Mort Poulos, the barn is a community center. The orchard feeds half the valley. Children still play under the branches. Travelers sometimes stop and ask about the place, with the carved bench overlooking the arroyo. Locals always smile and say the same thing. That's where the tycoon gave up gold for love, and where love made something that gold never could. And if you sit there long enough, just as the wind begins to shift and the blossoms begin to fall, you might hear their laughter in the trees, and know that some roots grow deeper than memory.